this video is going to cover the photosynthesis part of Unit 3 of National 5 Biology. This very first video is going to cover the stages, and then the next video will cover the limiting factors and how to measure rates of photosynthesis. So some of this you might know from earlier on in your school time. So photosynthesis generally is a process by which green plants, specifically green plants, use light energy. Okay, and they use that light energy to make food. Okay, and in particular, it would be sugar that they make. Alright? Now the process that this occurs in, or where this process occurs and what structure this process occurs in, are the chloroplasts. Now again, this should be a revision from the earlier part of National 5. Okay, and in particular, the chloroplasts contain chlorophyll. Now the purpose of that chlorophyll is to trap light energy, because that light energy is then used later in the process. Okay, and that light energy normally comes from the sun. Now that light energy is then converted into chemical energy. Now if we think about what we know about chemical energy, we would have thought about it in terms of respiration. So think about respiration and what that energy transporter is, okay? So it's stored in that same energy transport as we talked in respiration. It's stored in ATP. All right, now photosynthesis is a chemical reaction. So just like all chemical reactions, it's controlled by enzymes. So again, if you're trying to think about all these topics as relating to one another, think about what you know about enzymes. Enzymes are affected by temperature. And that's absolutely the case for these enzymes involved in photosynthesis. So if temperature is too low, enzymes aren't as active and therefore photosynthesis won't work as quickly. If temperature is too high, those enzymes will denature. Again, that process will stop. So be aware of all these things linking back to what we know. Right, and then the last part is that they have two stages. The first stage is the light reactions, and the second stage is what's known as carbon fixation. Now, based on the names of those, you'll be able to determine what's involved in that, at least in some respects. So I'm going to go over the breakdown of that in a wee sec. Now, just to kind of link you back to some of the stuff that you'll know from some of the previous topics apart from enzymes, this should hopefully be familiar to you. Okay, so this is a leaf, and it's a section of a leaf. Okay, now these cells here are your palisade mesophyll cells. Right, and they have a large number of chloroplasts. Therefore, they are the main site of photosynthesis within that leaf. So try and remember that a lot of these things are linked together. They're linked to Unit 2 in this, in terms of leaf structure, and they're linked to Unit 1 in terms of enzymes, okay, and also in terms of chloroplasts, and also in terms of ATP. They're linked in loads of ways, okay? So chlorophyll traps light energy and allows it to be converted into chemical energy, which is stored as ATP. Right? So you might know the overall equation for photosynthesis because you probably would have learned about it earlier on in your school career. So there's kind of two sides to an equation as always. So the first side is the raw materials. Right, so what is essentially needed for that whole process to go ahead. And the raw materials for photosynthesis are CO2. Right, and bear in mind when you're writing these chemical formula that the 2 is subscript, it's below these, okay? So CO2 is one of the main things, and CO2 comes from the air. And think about leaf structure. CO2 would enter through those stomata. Okay, and the second raw material is water. Now again, think about Unit 2 and think about leaf structure and think about plant transport systems. That water is from the roots. And it travels up in the xylem to that leaf. Okay? Now then we have the arrow, not an equal sign, because it's an equation, okay? And then we have our products, which are made at the end. Right, now you might notice that this overall equation is actually looking similar to respiration, but it's reversed. Okay, so we've got CO2 and H2O being taken in, which is the two things that we produce during respiration. And the products are the two things that we would take in during respiration. So we have sugar as our main product. And then we also have oxygen as our byproduct. So oxygen is released to the air. Okay, which is how we then end up using it to breathe in. Now there's one other wee point to mention about this overall equation, is that there's requirements. Okay, so photosynthesis, as well as requiring raw materials, requires a couple of other things to actually work, okay? So it requires enzymes, like we talked about. It requires light energy, like we talked about. And it also requires chlorophyll to trap that light energy. Okay, so these three things, without them, you'll not allow this to work. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is start talking about the different stages. So, like I said before, the first stage is light reactions. Now, in any kind of tests and questions that you might get, you'll be given a diagram or you can be asked to describe it fully. So what I'm going to do is do both here, okay? So in the light reactions, it kind of does what it says on the tin, you need light, okay? So before I talk about the light involved, if we think back to the previous sheet, we talked about the fact that it needs chlorophyll, and it's within those chloroplasts that you have chlorophyll, okay? So that light energy is trapped by chlorophyll. Okay, and bear in mind that chlorophyll is contained in chloroplasts. So in the light reactions, we use light energy, okay, that comes normally from the sun, but it can be from lamps and things depending on where this plant is. And it's used to split up water. Okay, so H2O is your chemical symbol for water. And that basically means that it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen. Now, we're not in chemistry, you don't need to worry about balancing these. Okay, but I'm just going to write the full names of them anyway. So what then is produced, okay, as products of this breakdown of the light splitting up water are two things. Okay, so we produce one of our products, which is oxygen, which is released by being diffused out of the cell, and then will end up being lost through the stomata. And then we also produce two other things. Okay, so think about it, we've gained the oxygen from here, we also split that water up into hydrogen. Okay, so hydrogen and oxygen are produced when water is split up by that energy trapped in chlorophyll. Now what I also said was that light energy is used to create, transferred into chemical energy. Okay, and that's stored in ATP. Okay, so in the light reactions we use light energy trapped by chlorophyll to split up water into oxygen and into hydrogen, and ATP is also made. And some of the diagrams that you might see on some of the other videos you might watch online, it tells you what ATP is made of. Don't worry about that, you don't need to know that. Right, so what I've got on the right hand side is a quick description of this stage, okay, because you might be asked in a question to describe this process. So just underline the key points. Light energy, okay, trapped by chlorophyll, splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, that oxygen is a byproduct, so it diffuses out of the cell and then is lost. But hydrogen and ATP are actually used in that second stage. So these are passed on to the next stage. So these two, I'm just going to put as a wee kind of indication, are passed to that next stage. And that next stage is called the carbon fixation stage. Okay, and they're used within that. So obviously it follows on that we're going to then talk about carbon fixation, so I'm going to move on to that now. So this second stage of photosynthesis is called carbon fixation. Now again, you might be able to determine from the title what carbon fixation involves. So if I just quickly jump back to our main overall equation. So far we've used water and we've made oxygen. Right, but we've yet to use carbon dioxide and we've yet to make sugar, and that's exactly what happens in that second stage. So carbon dioxide, which is again one of our raw materials, okay, is then combined with hydrogen from that first stage. Right, and then generally that just creates sugar. So I'll stick to the colours I had, since this is a product. So it makes sugar. Now this only works because it uses energy from ATP. Okay, so ATP isn't actually a substance that is involved in the directly involved in making sugar, in terms of it's not part of sugar. Okay, but the energy from ATP is used to create sugar. Okay, by combining CO2 and hydrogen. So in terms of your description of that then, hydrogen from the light reactions, okay, from that previous stage, combines with CO2 and it makes sugar. And then ATP, also from the first stage, provides the energy for this. So ATP isn't combined with CO2 and hydrogen, it's just providing energy for that. Right, so the next step in this process is basically just what that sugar then that we've made in this process up here is used for. Okay, and that's where we describe it as the fate of sugar. So fate just basically means what it's going to be used for. So that sugar produced by photosynthesis contains chemical energy, okay, because that ATP transfers its chemical energy to it. So that sugar and the energy in that sugar is used in 3 specific ways. So those 3 ways are, right, and you probably already know this in terms of thinking about what you know about sugar already, so particularly glucose, is it's used in respiration. Okay, because remember plants respire too. Now what it's also used for is it's either converted or it's stored and used as another form. So it is stored as starch, which is known as a storage carbohydrate. Okay, because sugars, starch, and the next one are all carbohydrates because they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so it's stored as starch, which is why we can detect whether a plant has been photosynthesizing by testing it for the presence of starch. Or it can be converted, and it's converted to something called cellulose. Now we should hopefully know what cellulose is already, the fact that it is used in cell walls, and it's called a structural carbohydrate. Okay, and it's made it's as part of cell walls. Okay, so these are the 3 fates of sugar. They're either used in respiration, stored as starch, or converted to cellulose. Okay, so if you're asked that in an exam question, these are the 3 uses, the 3 ways that sugar can then be used. So what I'm now going to do is just kind of combine all the stuff that I've just told you. So I've got a diagram here, which is very basic at the moment, and it shows the kind of guts of what, or will show the guts of the whole process of photosynthesis. So what we need to think about just very quickly is the overall equation now. So CO2 plus H2O makes sugar and oxygen. So remember this overall equation because that does contribute. So this is light energy here that's coming from the sun. Okay, this is a chloroplast. And this green stuff in it is chlorophyll. Okay, and that light energy is trapped by chlorophyll. Okay, now that light energy trapped by chlorophyll is used to break down water. It's used to split water. Okay, so that water comes in and it's split up. Okay, so it's split up into two things. Well, two things, and then it releases another. So it's split up and it creates or releases oxygen. And it's split up also into hydrogen. Okay, and at the same time that light energy is converted to chemical energy, which is then stored in ATP. Right, now hydrogen and ATP are then transferred over to this second stage. That second stage, carbon fixation, uses carbon. Okay, so just as a wee reminder as well to go back to this overall equation, we've used our water and we've made our oxygen. So we've still got to use our CO2, which is exactly what happens here. Okay, and we combine it with hydrogen. And then that energy from ATP is used to help it create sugar. Okay, so now if we go back to our overall equation, we've used CO2 and we've made our sugar. Now then, to refer back to the fates of sugar then, that sugar can then be used for respiration. It can be stored as starch, or it can be used to make cellulose. Okay, these are all your three fates. Now that whole thing summarizes the whole of your photosynthesis stages. Now you need to know these really in depth so that you understand the next part and understand how this all works together. Okay, not all diagrams look exactly like what I've got, but you should be able to identify the main parts and see which bit comes from which area. Okay, so you could be asked what this is, or what this is, or what this is, so make sure you can fill in the blanks. Alright, and that finishes off the process of photosynthesis.